Good evening, everyone. My name is Grace Jansen, and today I'm going to talk to you about plant reproduction. So the first type of reproduction that plants carry out is sexual reproduction. Um, this requires genetic materials or DNA from two parents. The male and female sex cells are going to be called the gametes. So fertilization occurs when that genetic material or DNA from the male and female gametes combine and they form an offspring. So offsprings are usually produced sexually and are genetically diverse, which means they're not identical to the parent plants. They have varying DNA. And then this genetic diversity basically offers less susceptibility to disease and the ability to adapt and change to the surrounding environment. So in flowering plants, they sexually reproduce through a process called pollination. The flowers contain male sex organs called a stamen, and then they contain the female sex organs, which are called pistils. So inside the stamen is an anther, and this is what contains the pollen, the male gamete that's going to fertilize the female gamete. So that pollen in the anther must be moved from the anther to the stigma, which is a part of the pistil, and that's where the ovule or the egg is. So there's two different types of pollination. There's self-pollination and there's cross-pollination. Self-pollination is when the plant's own pollen fertilizes its own eggs. So that pollen that's in the anther somehow gets to the eggs or the ovules inside the pistil, and that's self-pollination. So it pollinates by itself. Cross-pollination is when outer factors have a role in the process. So wind, rain, or animals, insects can move pollens from one plant to another. This is a big promoter of genetic diversity, considering that an animal can take pollen from a flower a mile away and bring it to another flower, which provides for great genetic diversity. So there's multiple different types of pollinators, and these are the animals that actually carry the pollen between plants. So the colors and the smells attract pollinators to the flowers, and then the pollen sticks on the animal as it feeds on that flower's nectar. And so when that animal is done with that flower, he goes to another flower, and that pollen that is stuck to the surface of their skin or their fur then gets transferred onto that flower, and that's when fertilization occurs. So good examples of pollinators are bees, moths, butterflies, hummingbirds, beetles, sometimes even birds and bats and rodents and things like that. So the other type of reproduction in plants is asexual reproduction. This only requires DNA from one parent. Therefore, the offspring of asexually reproduced plants are genetically identical to their parent plants, or they're basically clones. And these asexually produced plants lack any genetic diversity because they're obviously the exact same as their parent plant. So they're more susceptible to disease, less adaptable to the surrounding environment, things like that. So vegetative propagation is kind of a form of asexual reproduction, and it does not require seeds or spores or really any like fertilization to happen. The offspring grow from another part of the parent plant. So for example, like potatoes, they reproduce using things called tubers. These are underground growths that produce new plants from stems or new points of growth. And then ginger uses rhizomes, and these are stems that grow sideways and branch apart to kind of new points of growth where they grow a new plant. And then strawberries kind of do the same thing. They reproduce using stolons, which are basically stems that grow along the ground, and they kind of anchor themselves into the soil, and that's where they develop new roots and grow into new plants. There's also fragmentation. This is when new plants grow from small parts of a parent plant that broke off and fell to the ground, or a lot of people will cut leaves off of their plant and put them in water or soil to grow. Something similar to this is like green onions. A lot of people will chop their green onion and then put it in water and it'll just begin to grow a new one. So, and liverworts and mosses are also reproducing by fragmentation. Next, I'm going to talk about the alternation of generations. This is basically a type of life cycle that's found in terrestrial plants. Generations of individuals alternate between haploid and diploid organisms in this life cycle. So some key facts to keep in mind before I explain the cycle. Mitosis is a type of cell division where one cell divides and creates two genetically identical daughter cells that are diploid, meaning they have two sets of each chromosome. Meiosis, on the other hand, is a type of cell division where one cell divides and produces a cell or cells that have half the number of chromosomes, which makes it haploid. The alternation of generations uses both of these processes. So we'll start kind of with that sporophyte generation. Sporophytes are diploid, meaning they have two sets of each chromosome. And this is when meiosis takes place in the sporangium, and that's when it creates haploid spores. So these spores have only one set of chromosomes. And these haploid spores from that point go through mitosis, and then they divide into gametophytes that are also haploid. Next is the gametophyte generation. So from those haploid gametophytes, those divide into gametes, which are the female and male sex cells. And from there, the male and female gametes combine to create a diploid zygote. That is the process of fertilization. So after that, that zygote then divides through mitosis and becomes diploid again. And it comes all the way back to the sporophyte. So as I said, this was a life cycle. So it continues to keep going in the same circle, basically. So here is the life cycle of a fern diagram. This is something that we did in lab. We got spores and attempted to grow full functioning ferns from these spores. And so I can kind of explain how this process works. So you start down here with the new sporophyte, which matures into the mature sporophyte and grows to be a large fern that's functioning, growing, living, all of that. And so on the back of these leaves on the fern, there's these things called sporangiums. Well, inside the sporangium is where meiosis takes place and creates these haploid spores. From there, those spores undergo mitosis and they become mature gametophytes. And those gametophytes become the male and female gametes. And from there, the sperm and the egg, the male and female gametes, go through fertilization to create a diploid zygote. So once this zygote is produced and it is diploid, it has two sets of chromosomes, it undergoes mitosis again and becomes that brand new sporophyte. So it just starts its life cycle all over again. And that is it. Thank you very much for giving me your time and listening to me talk about plant reproduction and the alteration of generations. Thank you very much.